All right, so we'll just get going. If anybody else jumps in, I'll just add them to the session. So first off, a big thanks to Lauren Guilfoyle for taking time out of her Sunday evening to be with us here today. I know it's midday for the lads in New York. So this is week 3 of the session. So lads, again, if there's anything, if you get a chance, maybe take your phone out or like a notepad or something, and anything that springs to your mind that you think's useful. Just for listen, all these sessions are improving your performance. If you take 1 or 2 things away, brilliant. That's all we're looking. So we're delighted to have Lauren with us today. And this session focuses mainly on looking after your body and physiotherapy. So Lauren, sort of physio. If I miss anything out, Lauren, just jump in here. But you have a Bachelor of Science from physiotherapy from UL. You took research into sport participation and injury prevention in Limerick GA Underage Academy. Your introduction of doing physiotherapy came with Tipperary Senior Camogies in 2017. From there on, you were the Tipperary Minor Hurlers head physio, while assisting the senior footballers at the same time from 2018 to 2020. You've been appointed, just some of the stuff here, 2020, you were appointed the physiotherapy to the AIL League of Champions Cork Constitution, while taking up the role of head physiotherapy with the Rugby Academy Ireland's national women's team U20s this year. So definitely qualified. We'll say that at the very least. Is that a ring, Lauren? Did I miss anything out?
No, you did your homework anyway.
No, that's not.
No, I think you got it all there. Most of the important things anyway. So yeah, will I just fire into this?
Yeah, I'll jump straight into the questions. I'm Lauren. So that the lads submitted them this past week. So the first one there was, if you get a common injury such as a sprain or a strain, after a session, what should you immediately do? What are the do's and don'ts?
Well, I suppose immediately after a session might be a little bit too late in some instances. Coming off can tend to be the correct strategy at times, depending on what the actual issue is. So something like a muscle injury, if it's in the mid-belly of the muscle, so it's away from a joint, that's one injury that probably should result in you coming off the pitch. So be it a training session, a running session, a skill session, or a game, because we can't really do anything at the pitch side to actually change that injury at that time. Whereas if it is something like a joint problem, or in this picture here, actually it was a cut. There are 2 things that we can actually have an impact on there and then. So tape is used to reinforce the joint and to stabilize the joint. So that's something that can happen, be it like actually on the pitch or pitch side or in the dressing room, and that can give you a little bit more time depending on the severity of the injury. And of course, like everything that we probably say here tonight will depend on the actual injury itself and how you deal with it, or the severity of the injury that you've actually occurred. So that's probably the first thing, knowing when to come off. A lot of the time the player will know themselves. I won't have to tell them. That might result in me doing some tests there and then. So if you're on the pitch and you can't do a double leg bridge because your hamstring is quite painful, well then we're not going to be able to run for the rest of the game, or if we can't do a single leg heel raise following a calf issue, well then we're not going to be able to run and hop for the rest of the game. So sometimes the player wants to play on, but you kind of have to show them, well, you're probably not physically able to, unfortunately. Following a game then, ice is probably the number 1 thing to get your hands on. And the reason for that is any injury that will have occurred, if it's joint related, ligament related, muscle related, is going to be a certain amount of inflammation. And I think at times inflammation probably gets a bad rap, and we're always talking about anti-inflammatories and this and that. But inflammation is actually what heals the structure or the site or whatever it might be. So we do need inflammation to occur, but what we don't want to happen is the body kind of overestimates how much inflammation is needed at a particular site, and that causes us a significant amount of swelling. And when you kind of look at that inflammation and what it actually is, it's like a mixture, it's like a cocktail of different chemicals that are needed at that particular zone or particular site. So if there's damaged muscle tissue, tissue, there's going to be different substances within the inflammation that will take away the dead muscle tissue. There'll also be some new muscle cells brought to the area with inflammation, and we'll also have some chemicals that will be giving us pain to alert us to the problem. So if the body kind of overestimates how much inflammation is needed, because the body doesn't always get it bang on, we can actually feel an awful lot more pain than maybe we really need to feel. So applying ice to an area straight away after an injury has occurred or straight away after a game will just reduce the amount of inflammation that we'll get there, but it won't stop it altogether, because of course we do need it in some capacity. So it basically, like the mechanics behind how that actually happens is it just makes the area cold, the blood vessels get a little bit skinnier, so not as much fluid can get there essentially. So icing, you don't need to overdo it with icing. If we apply ice for about 20 minutes, we've reached the lowest temperature that we can actually create at that space. So icing for 20 minutes is probably enough. Anything kind of beyond that, and we're not really seeing any more additional kind of impact or benefit. So just from a kind of a ease of access, or kind of having other things to do in your life, about 20 minutes is fine every 2 to 3 hours. There is a place for compression as well. So again, it's more kind of to alleviate some of the inflammation. So just wrapping the thigh or the ankle or the arm or whatever it might be, wrapping it in something just to basically create a little bit more pressure in the area. Elevation is another one that you may or may not do. There isn't as much evidence for that, so don't feel like you have to do it, but there's no harm in it either. So yeah, icing is probably the number one thing. Next comes stretching. Don't do it is probably the easiest way to put it. So particularly if it's a muscle issue or a ligament issue, if we think about kind of what that structure is, it's made up of loads of different fibers. So if you can imagine, like, you have a shirt and there's a tiny little bit of a tear in it, and you grab one end of it and grab the other and pull, which is what a stretch is, we're going to make that problem worse. We're like, that area is a tiny bit damaged, and we're adding more stress to the area, so we're probably actually going to make that problem worse. So in that instance, I definitely wouldn't be stretching a muscle. So again, if it's a hamstring, I wouldn't be getting down doing my hamstring stretches, but equally things like putting your socks on, putting your shoes on, just being mindful of positions that can actually put that muscle in a stretched position. And aside from that as well, foam rolling, don't do it. If you could visualize, if you had a hamstring tear and you visualize that it was nearly kind of like a cut on the skin, you wouldn't go pushing a foam roller into it. It wouldn't make sense for that cut to heal. So we don't want to do that for a hamstring issue either, because what it essentially is bleeding in the hamstring muscle or the calf muscle or whatever it might be. We want to promote and kind of create a nice healing environment. So digging something into it just isn't going to be beneficial. It could actually make it worse, especially if it's the kind of the first 24 to 48 hours. So yeah, number one thing is ice, and then the second thing is don't stretch and don't foam roll. And then after that, it kind of does depend on the severity of the issue. Pain is a really important thing. It's helpful. I know we can shy away from it an awful lot, but pain will tell us what the body wants to do and what it doesn't want to do. So I wouldn't be taking an awful lot of painkillers, unless, now obviously we have to kind of factor in here if you need to go to work or you need to do something that you just can't get out of and it's very uncomfortable. But if you're sitting at home or you're just chilling out for the day, I wouldn't be taking painkillers, because we need to know what's good for the body and what's bad. And if we blur the lines by taking painkillers unnecessarily, it just means that we could actually place ourselves into positions or do activities that actually might be causing more harm than good in the early stages. Then after that, if you have access to someone, to get someone to actually have a look at it, assess the issue. Sometimes it's just a case of 48 hours, let the inflammation settle back down. We haven't lost any strength. We might have a very low grade issue and we just need to modify what we're doing for a couple of days. So like, if we look here, this picture would have been from the Munster Minor Championship, where we had matches every weekend for 4 weeks in a row. So there was instances definitely towards the end of that championship where if a guy picked up an issue on the Saturday or the Sunday, he mightn't have trained all week, but he would have played fully on the following Sunday. But that's because we had to manage this inflammation kind of cycle. And training on the Tuesday might not have been the best idea, because he might have kind of re-entered that inflammatory cycle for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and that's not what you want kind of heading into the last round of a Munster Championship campaign. So that is, I suppose, kind of knowing what your boundaries are and how much you can do, or what kind of are the consequences after doing something. So in this instance, when we had those couple of players, that's kind of talking to the management and explaining that no, Jimmy is going to be fine for the weekend, just that if we play him Tuesday night in training, there's a potential that he will be in an awful lot of pain Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then that's not kind of the preparation that you want. You'd nearly prefer he does nothing on the Tuesday night. Wednesday, Thursday, he might do a little bit of work on his own. Friday night, he might be fully involved in the puck around before the match the weekend. So it's kind of knowing when that's appropriate and when that's not. And I don't expect you guys to know that yourself, but that's where kind of seeking out advice can help. And sometimes where sitting out a session can be the best thing you can do, depending on what the actual issue is itself. They're probably the do's and don'ts.
That's top class, yeah.
I hope this I haven't overcomplicated it there.
That's perfect. Especially I think with the stretching too, because it's something probably that first thing pops in your head if you do feel like a pain on your say in your hamstring or in your quads, wherever it may be. Maybe the first sort of thing you think of. That's top class. Lauren.
No, I think stretching kind of gets an overly good reputation. It does very little compared to kind of what we all assume it does, or what kind of the general consensus or the general population's opinion of it. So I nearly leave it more often than not to not stretch, because it can. I've had guys come in a couple of days later and all they've been doing is stretching for the past 2 days, and I'm like, oh, okay, not ideal.
Right.
So yeah.
There's you've mentioned Tipperary minors, but you've involved in a lot of clubs. I suppose, from your background, what would be the most common GA injury that you've seen over the last number of years?
It probably varies between hurling and football, and depending on the kind of the age group as well. So the older you are, the more kind of open you are to injury, because you've probably got a larger injury history. The most common injury in GA is hamstring issues. So about 25% of GA injuries is to the hamstring muscle group. And that's something that I think is preventable a lot of the time. So I'm sure there's no point in saying what the most common injury is if we don't say how to avoid actually sustaining it. So when it comes to a hamstring injury, it's exposing yourself to high speeds and exposing yourself to them quite regularly. So the most common, let's say, activity or thing that would cause a hamstring issue in hurling or football is sprinting, and it's the leg swinging through the air. So you've one foot on the ground, but the other leg is swinging through and just about to hit the floor. So it's the swing phase. That's where the hamstring is trying to create as much load as it possibly can, but it's also lengthening. So this is where your Nordic hamstring curls are really important. Your deadlifts are really important. Your single leg deadlifts are really important. So these are all exercises that get the hamstring muscles strong in that long position. So that's one thing that you can do in the gym. And then from a pitch perspective, the most important thing is running at high speeds regularly. There's no point just leaving the high speed running to a game situation. We need to be doing that at training yourself if you feel like you aren't getting enough high speed sprints in training, because the body adapts. So if we put it under pressure 2 or 3 times a week at these very high speed, very fast pace runs, the body's going to adapt to that, because it's going to understand that you want to do this activity, so it'll adapt and be able to tolerate it, and then you'll be able to nearly run that bit more or do that more frequently. So don't forget, running at high speed is grand for one or two reps, but are you able to do it with 65 minutes gone in a game as well when you're quite fatigued? So we're only going to get those adaptations to occur, and we're only going to see the body adapt to that and tolerate that if we do it consistently throughout the week. So that's probably the most important thing when it comes to hamstrings. And then in terms of like distances for sprints, like I'm not saying go for 100 meters at 100%. We're looking at about, I think it's about 18 sprints in a game. That's about 15 to 20 meters long. So in terms of like reps and sets, what I normally advise would be 3 sets of 6 sprints. And you think about hamstrings as well, it's not a case of you're gradually building up to a sprint and you're gradually slowing down. It'd be a case of we're jogging to a cone, we're taking off and we're sprinting and we're maintaining 100% for 15 to 20 meters. And then we're hitting the second cone and we're coming to a sudden stop, we're putting the brakes on. Because if you consider a game situation, we're not kind of slowly, gradually building pace. We're kind of waiting for a breaking ball and we're taking off. And then we're reacting to something else, so a player coming against us, or we're sidestepping, or something else is occurring, so including acceleration and deceleration in that as well. So that'd be something that I would be considering kind of adding into like your collective group sessions, or doing that individually, but doing it in a gradual approach. So not going out tomorrow and doing 24 sprints at 100 meters, because that's a massive spike in load. Kind of keep track maybe from next week on and kind of build it up as the weeks go. Otherwise the body's going to break down. The second most common injury, I suppose, definitely from a football perspective, is ankle issues. Ankle sprains, so ligament issues, most commonly on the outside of the ankle joint rather than the inside, and that's just because we have a bit more kind of movement on the outside of the ankle joint. And in terms of preventing that, it's kind of single leg gym work. So I know a lot of guys spend time trying to like up their squat 1 rep max and their deadlift 1 rep max and all this in the gym. But when you think about it, we're never on 2 feet when we're playing a game. Like if you look at the player behind there in that image, like he's on 1 foot and then he's transferring his weight to the other foot. So we need to be able to stabilize our entire weight, our entire mass on 1 foot at a time, and do that very quickly over uneven ground a lot of the time, or well, it depends on the surface that you're playing on. I know you have AstroTurf over there, so you're probably getting away a bit easier than us over here. So doing some single leg stability work, and that's where technique is key. I'd be dropping the weight right back down to body weight and see how we get on with a single leg squat, single leg deadlift, single leg stand, but like puck a ball off a wall, kick a ball off a wall, hand boss a ball off a wall. We're commonly not kind of playing on bouncy castles and whatnot, so I think balance boards probably isn't that functional or transferable, but we are playing with balls and we're playing with other people. So if we can kind of challenge our stability closer to kind of a match situation, we're going to see that transference a little bit more. So that would be kind of our ankle prevention, and then progressing that to like our hops and our jumps over hurdles, down off steps, up onto boxes, these kind of things. So all single leg work, because double leg, unfortunately, we can do strength, we can build strength from a double leg perspective, but we're not going to get a huge amount of stability, not in a GA capacity anyway. So they're probably the 2 most common.
Perfect. No, I think it's good too, because there's a few coaches I'm on tonight as well, so it's even good to sort of pick up different things maybe to do with each team that we've hurlers and footballers on the call tonight, but especially with if you're already in sprints, what sets and what distances. So that's absolutely useful for players and coaches. One of we've sort of just nearly touched on it there, Lauren, but have you worked with many teams that did other types of training, for example, Pilates and yoga, and was there much benefit towards it?
Any of the teams that I've worked with haven't done it collectively, and I think that's probably the best approach. Well, personally, my own opinion on that, because I think a lot of these activities, they don't suit everyone, or no one, or we all don't have the same interest in them. But I do think there is most definitely a kind of a time and a place for both yoga and Pilates. I think yoga is a nice activity to increase mobility, and it's also a very low impact activity, so it's something that we can do on our days off, on our rest days in between sessions. So if we're training on a Monday and a Wednesday, it's something we can do on a Tuesday that will increase mobility. So it'll really kind of stretch out the legs. It'll get you to be much more aware of your body and how it moves, and kind of you can even start to see kind of improvements in range of motion when we look at kind of the different movements involved with the hips, with the ankles, with the wrists, even with the shoulders. And it's non taxing in terms of facilities or in terms of equipment. It literally is a mat and your body weight. So I think yoga is a brilliant one, but it just doesn't suit everyone. It's quite slow. It's quite self-aware. It's it just doesn't suit everyone. So I wouldn't be recommending that kind of a whole squad do it, but I think it probably would pay off for a couple of guys that want to try it and find benefit from it. Pilates then, a lot of core strength and a lot of single extremity strength, so single leg, for example. And that's, I find Pilates is brilliant because what you learn in Pilates, you can transfer to your gym work, and it can improve your gym work, improve your technique in the gym. Because a lot of the time we kind of see compensations with different gym movements, both double leg and single leg, whereas Pilates can kind of get into the nitty gritty of that, and you can start to kind of understand the kind of the principles or the basics of different movements. And then when you get into the gym, you can obviously start to load them up and add resistance to those. So yeah, I've never been a part of a panel that have used one collectively. I think maybe there probably was a little bit of more of that this year now with COVID and lockdown and whatnot, and trying to come up with different things. But I do think both definitely have a time and a place. And I think yoga, even especially from a mental perspective, I know you had Maura Trassa on last week. I think I'm sure she would have spoken about mindfulness and whatnot. Yoga is fantastic for that. Kind of you're zoning out and you're just spending a little bit more time thinking through things, you're kind of yourself and that. But again, it depends on the teacher and whatnot. But there's some great videos on YouTube. I'm doing it myself, Yoga with Adrienne, if you want to look her up. She's fantastic. So, and that's what I do on my off days between running sessions. So it's not an impact where we're giving the joints, we're giving the muscles time to recuperate and heal after maybe some hard pitch sessions or some hard gym sessions. So
top class. No, that's very interesting. And like, so I'll tell you what, I did a session with Pilates there a couple of weeks ago. That's take going for any lads who want to give it a try. It's not as easy as it sounds. But I suppose the next thing there, Lauren, is how long, in your opinion, should the right warm up last? I know a lot of our lads will do the GA15 one between static and dynamic stretching, but you've involved in a lot of teams. What would you say is the right amount of time between once you get everybody out in the pitch and get going between the start and then the match itself?
Well, it depends, I suppose, again, on what the activity is. If it's going to be a kind of a low intensity pitch session, skill session, it probably doesn't need to be that long. If it's a game, then it needs to be about 15 minutes. And I suppose it all comes back to, well, what's the purpose of the warm up? And what are you actually trying to achieve with it? And there obviously is a skill component to that, sharpening up kind of your first touch and whatnot before a game. But from a physical performance perspective, where the main function of it is to increase the heart rate and basically get enough blood flow to muscles in order for those muscles to actually be able to generate force and to stabilize joints and do all these different things. So if we're heading into a championship game, we need to get our heart rate up to a fairly decent level. So we're kind of gradually ramping that up. We're starting quite slow and we're building. And I think if you mentioned the GA15, that's brilliant. That basically kind of covers most bases, and you can obviously change and modify some elements of that in case it's starting to get boring or what. But yeah, if it's a game, I would be thinking about 15 minutes, and then that doesn't stop players from doing their own warm-up in the dressing room, specific to potentially injuries that they might have had. If they've had previous hamstring issues, are they doing some bridges or some kind of deadlift patterns in the dressing room beforehand? If it's a hip flexor, maybe they're doing some band work for the front of the legs. If it's a patellar tendon issue that they have, maybe they're doing some knee extension holds beforehand. I think as well there's a mental component to that too, kind of if we're like ideally, and it does happen quite a lot at inter-county level, that we're maybe about, say if the match is at 2:00, from about 1:15 you're starting to see guys kind of prepare themselves, and that's more from a mental perspective than anything. They're grabbing their bands, they're taking their corner in the dressing room or wherever it is, and while they're actually warming up different muscle groups, they're probably taking a bit of time to kind of focus on the task ahead, and they're kind of leaving what has happened beforehand to then, and it's kind of everything is now focused on the game. So it's a nice kind of mixture of the two, mental preparation as well as physical preparation. But then getting out onto the pitch, if you're going to do your static stretching, it should probably be done first thing. Because if we start to kind of move into our dynamic stretching and then into our running drills, into our skills drills, the aim of those is to get the heart rate up. So if we do all that, it's a pet peeve of mine, we do all that and then we stop and take 5 minutes to stretch and our heart rate just drops back down again. So we're kind of losing some of the benefits. Granted, now if you wanted to kind of have some last minute kind of tactical discussions, I'd keep it short, or else I'd be kind of adding in some light movement with that. So even if we're down and we're doing our bridges, we're doing our single leg deadlifts, squats, kind of part of what the GA15 actually is, but to not kind of stop the entire warm up, stand up for 5 minutes discussing and stretching, because we have undone a little bit of the work that we would have achieved already at that point. So static stretching first, then into your dynamic work, into warming up your different muscle groups, and then obviously into your skills and your running. And you want to be building up to kind of your high speed runs. So your high speed running is kind of anywhere between 18 to 22 kilometers an hour. I know you probably mightn't have GPS stats or GPS monitors even tracking that at the time, but you definitely want to be exposing guys to that kind of level of sprinting just beforehand. We're not obviously emptying the tank. We just want to kind of get the joints a little bit oiled up. But yeah, about 15 minutes I would think max. Anything kind of longer than that, and like we had discussions in the past after games, kind of what worked in the warm-up, what didn't, and even asking your players like how ready did you feel for a game when the warm-up was over? Were you gassed? Were you kind of a little bit fatigued or tired after it? If that's the case, then maybe we need to look at the amount of ground covered in the warm-up. But yeah, I think taking on board some player feedback is really important too, and potentially bringing down the intensity at times, or kind of looking at how you're actually building it up from the starting position to the end position. Are we kind of going hell for leather initially, or should we maybe just take it a little bit handier? Like if you look at the likes of Kilkenny warming up, I'm always fascinated with it because there's very few cones. It's just a case of kind of a puck around in their instance, and then it's gradually built up in tempo. So yeah, I suppose that's kind of the fundamentals. Allow your players to do their individual stuff first, and make sure, and this is again is another bugbear of mine as a physio, your lads coming in looking for something to be looked at or rubbed or taped, and the warm-up is just about to start, and I'm kind of going, you're going to get injured if you miss this warm-up. So make you, like, that player needs to make sure that they're in with the physio well ahead of time, that they do not miss a warm-up, because being in with me isn't going to prepare them for the activity or the game ahead. So I'm not sure what your schedule is like for games and whatnot, but that's definitely kind of a rule that I try to implement very early on, is that no player misses the warm-up regardless of what the issue is, and they need to make themselves known fairly early if physio is kind of on the table.
Oh, it's a good way of breaking up, like, to think of the warm-up as that, like, in the three, skills, warming up physically, and then even the mental prep that goes behind it as well. I'm learning it's a good way of breaking it down for lads. You've sort of touched on foam rolling, and it's something that's sort of coming more and more in the games, in the club level and county level. But is there foam rolling? Is there enough being done before after training, or have you seen much benefit of it? For example.
Foam rolling is like stretching. There isn't a huge amount of benefit to it. Again, it depends really on what benefit you're actually looking for, really. It actually, prior to performance, there is some research to suggest that it actually might reduce the amount of force you can actually generate, so power and force that you can generate. So again, it's very minute. Like if you're in a routine of it now, I wouldn't necessarily say stop, but I wouldn't be berating lads or criticizing guys if they chose not to actually foam roll either before games. I think as well that, like, it's definitely before a match or before a training session, there's probably a lot of mental preparation happening in that time as well. So I think it depends on kind of what performance measure you're going with, but I do think, yeah, foam rolling, it's foam rolling and massage guns, you can probably lump them into the same thing. Very short-term benefits. It mostly affects your central nervous system. It doesn't actually affect the muscle itself, so it kind of goes in and turns down the sensation of tightness rather than the actual tightness. So I would, like, if someone feels quite tight after a match or a session or kind of a couple of days after these things, I wouldn't be looking to the foam roller. I'd be looking to the coach or whoever it might be and kind of see, well, can we adjust what we're doing in training so that we don't have these consequences in the days afterwards, because that's exactly what foam rolling and these massage guns are. They're kind of cures for something once it's arrived, but potentially is there a possibility that we can actually adjust and stop this from happening from the get-go? So yeah, foam rolling, they're cheap, they're cheerful, they're 20 quid, they're horrible depending on where you're foam rolling, but a lot of the time personally I wouldn't tell someone to go and do it, just because I think sometimes it can be not a waste of time, but like things like getting a good night's sleep, getting a decent diet, so getting protein in, getting carbohydrates into the diet to replenish kind of the lost energy or the used energy, and getting protein in to heal the damaged muscle or whatever it might be. They're the things that you'll see the significant improvement from. The foam rolling and the massage guns will see a very small improvement for a very short period of time. So unless you have everything else perfectly fine, it wouldn't be a priority. I think this is where you start to run into, and I had a discussion actually with Cathal Barrett of Tipperary recently, because he saw me talking about this and he was like, I'm always foam rolling. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't, because he puts it up on Instagram with these foam rollers and massage guns. And I'm like, yeah, but you never show us going to bed at 10 o'clock and getting up at 7, and you don't show us the really boring meal that has all your macronutrients, because that's not the fun thing to put on social media. So then everyone that follows him only sees the fancy stuff and the fancy foam roller and the fancy massage gun. So I think it's important that we don't forget the fundamentals, which is your kind of 8 or 7 to 8 hours sleep, your decent diet, you're well hydrated, and most importantly, the training that you're doing is appropriate to where you're at right now. So sometimes that's what needs to be modified, and that could be modified from player to player. So someone returning from injury, someone returning from a period away, or someone that needs to kind of get more sprint work into their session, for example, that can be kind of slightly modified. But if we're relying on the foam roller or we're relying on the massage gun, I think there's probably an issue there somewhere. So
perfect. You probably already answered the question, right? But your top 4 or 5 ways to best recover after a tough session. So you mentioned sleep, you mentioned diet, you mentioned hydrate. Was there anything else I missed there, Lauren?
Well, they're the 3 most important ways to recover. They're the ones that will give you the big percentages and the significant improvements. After that, like we're kind of looking down, you could look at something like ice baths or kind of cold water immersion, or again our foam rollers or our massage guns. But unless we've kind of nailed the other 3, we're not going to see any significant improvements, and then we're kind of wasting your time really if you're going to play a match kind of a Saturday evening and stay out all night and eat poorly and go to the chipper and all of these different types of things. Grabbing your massage gun the next day isn't going to make much of a difference, unfortunately. So yeah, that's kind of, it sounds boring, I know. I'd love it to be a little bit more interesting than just sleep, eat well and drink well, but to be honest, that's kind of the most important ways. And I suppose following on from that is kind of planning your following week's session. So if you have a game on a Saturday, kind of, are you going to do a hard session on the following Monday, or maybe we're going to deload a little bit depending on kind of what's happening the following weekend, obviously, or kind of what the next couple of weeks are looking like, because you have to obviously allow whatever might have occurred, so little niggles that have been picked up, or just general kind of DOM soreness after a tough game, that we're not kind of creating issues by kind of having a hard session on the following Monday, or maybe pulling different lads. It's been often the case in Tipperary where the lads that played the full game won't train the following first night back. They'll just kind of have a bit of a puck around, whereas the guys that maybe weren't playing or weren't even on the 26th, they'll do a full session. So just kind of picking and choosing your battles in that regard.
Top class. It's just nice to hear that the simple stuff is what's best. It's not about the massage guns or them mats that I don't know what they're called, the pipes,
the little pricks on them,
they're honestly the worst things I've ever seen. You've touched on this here as well, and then we're into the last sort of question. But what is one of the lads just asked, what is the use and point of taping it, and is there much use from it?
So it depends on what you're actually taping. If it's something like your ankle or your knee, basically what it is, like if you consider, if like this is the knee, you've 2 bones, so you have your femur and your tibia, they are held kind of in place, and their motion is prevented from being too much by your ligaments. So our ligaments basically join bone to bone, and they only have a certain amount of movement. They can only kind of go so far. So if they get injured, there might be a little kind of grade 1 tear in one of those ligaments. What'll happen then is that your knee will be able to move a little bit more. And that's not a very nice environment for that ligament to actually heal. So if we're looking for fibers to knit back together again, we want to kind of prevent over motion or over stressing of those fibers. So one way to do that is to stabilize it with tape. So basically what the tape is doing is kind of replicating what the ligament actually does, just it's on the outside of the body rather than the inside. So that's essentially what taping is, and taping kind of varies from person to person. So your like what you might find comfortable, someone else might not. So that's pretty much kind of the purpose of taping. And we don't want to over tape either, because if we tape our knee to within an inch of its life, well then we're going to need to get movement from somewhere. So that's where we kind of start to see that the ankle might be nearly put under a little bit more pressure than it would be normally. So if we don't need to be taped, we don't need to have that much taping on, I would kind of recommend pulling back a little bit on that. Then when it comes to things like patellar taping, I see it here in the picture, I think it's number 10, is it? Has the patellar taping on there. That essentially is compression across the patellar tendon. So basically it's like someone's putting pressure on it for the game, just the tape is doing it for you. So we often see that at the patellar tendon, or maybe sometimes in the Achilles or in the elbow for kind of your tennis elbow type issues. So that's just a pain relieving strategy. And then lastly, your kinesio tape. Again, kind of, I do look at it in the same way as our foam rolling and our massage guns and whatnot. Does very little, has a great reputation. We used to have a lecturer in college, and it was like, oh, are we going to use the pink one or the blue one today? Like, because it literally doesn't make a blind bit of difference. It doesn't really do too much for muscular injuries. Like our muscles are made up of kind of two different structures that come together when they contract, and they kind of come away from each other when they relax. And there's thousands of those, millions maybe, within each muscle. So kind of putting like a pink tape on the outside of the hamstring isn't really going to do too much. But that being said, I'm looking at it from a purely physical perspective. If a player just feels a little bit more comfortable, even just having the feeling of the tape there to kind of remind them that they don't have like 100% hamstring function right now, we're only at 90, but then work away, that's fair enough. And there definitely is a kind of a place for it around joints as well, if we just kind of want a little bit more kind of tactile feedback, so that we can kind of be aware of like an old ankle injury or something like that. But yeah, kinesio tape isn't something that would often be brought out from my physio bag anyway. It's waterproof, so that's practical application for it. If you want to tape your ankle and it's raining, pop some kinesio tape over it. It'll keep it sticky for that little bit longer.
The last question there, Lauren, you've said like a lot of like insightful and useful information. I suppose if there's one or two pieces of advice that you could give to our lads, like what would it be? Is it maybe a pet peeve or something that's not done enough or not done at all?
Well, I think most of the guys here are under 21, are they?
Yeah.
So I think like at that point you're quite young in terms of like the length of a career you might have. And as I mentioned earlier, the number one risk factor for hamstring, ankle, hip flexor, knee, whatever it might be, the number one risk factor is having previously injured that particular body part. So I think if you are sustaining an injury kind of the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, or you kind of start to feel like a bit of a niggle, so it isn't a full injury and you need to modify your training a little bit, what I would say is to respect that issue and respect that injury, because you're the person that's going to be suffering the consequences of that 10, 15 years down the line, when you've had multiple hamstring tears or multiple knee meniscus issues, depending on whatever it might be. So really kind of paying attention to what it feels like, and then what you're actually being advised to do to actually prevent further issue and to recover as quickly as possible, which I know is much easier said than done. I've had to have very hard discussions myself with lads before different games that are really important, but they just physically aren't able to, or depending on the structure of the championship, it's just not the best idea to kind of play in the first round when you might have 2 or 3 or 4 more rounds following it. So that would be probably my number one piece of advice. And I suppose as well, kind of know that the body just takes whatever time it needs. Sometimes we just physically can't speed it up. We can't make the body heal any quicker. And to kind of nearly make peace with that in some instances. And we're always going to look for the quick fix for that, and taping definitely helps a little bit if it's a joint, but sometimes it just takes what it takes. And if we try to push it too quick, we can backtrack a little bit, and we can see some regression. So yeah, that's probably that would make my life as physio a little bit easier. So I'm hoping it'll make some of the players' life a bit easier too.
Yeah, no, that's top class, Lauren. That's all the questions that are submitted beforehand. And I'm just going to open it up to the lads if you've any questions for Lauren while she's here. Lauren, actually Simon, who's our games promotion officer, works a lot with the football teams. He's a question that I'm going to throw it out to you. How can coaches help players prevent hernia issues from pitch weight training? I frequently hear about players aged 30 plus developing hernia problems in the groin. Any tips for coaches to recognize symptoms of the hernia?
It's not something that I've come across too often here now myself, but again, maybe that's because I do work with kind of younger athletes. A lot of the time it can actually be misdiagnosed. So there is a lot of structures around that area. So there's kind of a couple of different terms that are used for kind of hip related groin pain, adductor related groin pain, abdominal related groin pain. It can be quite hard to diagnose a hernia, or it can just be kind of presenting with similar symptoms in that area. I suppose it kind of getting a full assessment is probably from a healthcare professional is the best way to go about that. In terms of actual prevention, like across the board with any exercise, it's making sure that an athlete is appropriately and accurately actually executing the exercise. People think they're doing their deadlift correctly or their single leg deadlift correctly, and then they start to load up. So if they're not moving very well and then adding on weight to that and getting strong and poor movement patterns, they're kind of they're putting stress on parts of the body that probably shouldn't be getting stressed in that particular movement. That's when we can start to see problems occurring. So like the muscle makeup of our core muscles is different from the structure of the muscles in our legs, for example. So I don't know, is there any vegans or vegetarians on the line, but if you visualize a roast chicken, the white meat versus the brown meat, that's different kind of muscular structure or muscular setup. So the brown meat has a lot of blood supply to it, can create an awful lot of force. It's used quite frequently for very forceful, kind of very fast movement. So like the chicken running around, the legs are going to be quite brown. Then our core meat, so our breast meat, for the want of a better phrase, is white, doesn't have as much blood supply. It's kind of there to be used consistently throughout the day. It's not used for very forceful contractions or very sudden movements. It's kind of there to maintain a nice stable base. So if we start to see players moving inappropriately, like I'm just visualizing a deadlift, for example, is one movement that can be executed quite poorly. When we should be really stressing our glutes and our hamstrings, we see guys using lower back muscles and overloading those when if we just tweaked the technique slightly, put more stress into the glutes and hamstrings, we're going to see better improvements anyway, because the right body part is getting the issue, or is getting the load, and then we're kind of offloading parts of the body that probably shouldn't be getting that kind of load.
Yeah,
I hope I answered that correctly.
Yeah, no, top class. I even think it goes back to even like spot and fix coaching. If it means dropping down a weight and looking at the technique as an overall form.
Like you're going to get more benefit from doing that, and like that's a discussion I've had to have numerous times, because I know ego comes into it as well. You don't want to drop down 10 kg or whatever, but the way around that with athletes is to tell them, well, if you actually execute this perfectly, the correct muscle is going to be getting all of the stress and the load, and we're actually going to see adaptation occur quicker because you're stressing the right area rather than compensating and getting more muscles involved. So instead of having 10 muscles doing the job of one, we're just going to get the one muscle doing it. So that's kind of a way around it that I can use with athletes to drop weight down.
Yeah, no, that's definitely good advice, actually, especially when ego kind of come into it. I suppose the last question there on from James Donovan just says, do you believe there's any benefit of swimming to prevent injuries?
It probably isn't directly transferable to GAA, just considering the shoulder movement that's involved in swimming. Like, it's not a bad thing, but it probably isn't directly transferable. Where I do see a role for swimming is in players that need kind of time off their feet, so off feet conditioning, where again, kind of going back to like you've had a heavy session at the weekend and you want to get a cardiovascular hit, but you don't want to actually load the legs any further. So again, I'm probably just going back to like the surface of the ground or whatever. If it's quite hard and whatnot, we can actually see some kind of bony reaction or bony inflammation, so our shin splints essentially. That's something that we need some time off our feet in order to let settle back down. So that's where the likes of swimming can come into it. Yes, so it kind of, I suppose you could lump it back into a recovery strategy really as well. It's not something I've ever heard of anyone doing consistently, and that they kind of place an awful lot of benefit towards in terms of preventing injury, but I think it's something that has a time and a place depending on kind of what the structure of the week is or what the issue is, or if there is an issue.
Top class, no, top class, Lauren. Listen, that's all our questions for today. I'm sorry, this evening.
Vicky, I had a question.
Oh, go on ahead there, Jared.
I just it came to my head as you were talking about training and playing on the hard ground. Would you? I guess the question: would you ever see any issue with constantly playing on an artificial pitch and training on hard ground on a regular basis? Because that's kind of what. That's kind of our. That's kind of what we do in New York. You know, we're either training on a extremely hard grass field, or we're playing on, you know, the artificial surface.
It's probably not something that I see consistently, but I do notice that there definitely is an increase in kind of lads complaining when we do switch from like the pitch to the AstroTurf, and it's just basically because of the change in surface. So basically when your foot hits the floor, your foot absorbs some of the force from hitting the hard surface. So like a soft grass pitch versus a hard kind of AstroTurf or concrete or sand or whatever it is. So the forces actually change, and the forces that are transmitted up through the lower leg change a little bit. So then what happens is, I kind of even going back to like my hamstring example, the body adapts to whatever loads are placed upon it. So if we suddenly start placing very kind of heavy loads upon it, it might break down and cause an injury, or it might just cause a little bit of irritation and inflammation. But it is something that the body adapts to. So if you're consistently exposing players to the same surface or very similar surfaces, it's not something that should be causing an issue, because their body will have adapted to it. Now, that being said, if you decided to bring them on a running session on the sand, like again, it's just a different surface, so the body isn't used to the kind of the loads that are created and the loads that you're absorbing in your legs on that surface. So there might be a very kind of short-lived reaction to it. But if you're consistent enough with your surfaces, then it shouldn't really be causing an issue.
No, brilliant. No, I suppose that's the biggest thing. A lot of our lads we train in Gaelic Park as well as club matches and county games are all there. So I suppose the body's used to it at this stage in the game.
Yeah,
from
the body adapts,
under 8 up.
most definitely.
Lauren, that's all the questions we have for you today. Listen, thank you very much. That was really insightful. My phone was pinging there because a few lads are saying great answer and top class and stuff. So that must be a real sign that it went well if they're texting me in the middle of it. So
maybe they're bored.
No, it's just to say, listen, thanks very much for your time. Really useful, and I'll send this recording out to the lads that couldn't jump on tonight. But Lauren, thank you very much, and myself and the rest of the lads like to take this opportunity to say best luck for the year ahead, whatever team you're with, and your masters as well. Good luck and completing that over the next number of months.
Thanks so much, and yeah, best of luck for yourselves, and hopefully I'll meet you all again in Gaelic Park someday.
Yep, sounds good. Sounds good. It's some summer, hopefully not the minute where things are a bit cold and miserable. But